We thought we were exploring the past, uncovering a city buried beneath the Appalachians for over 1 billion years. But we weren't prepared for the truth. Eternum fossilis wasn't just a discovery. It was alive and waiting. In part 1, we found impossible architecture, fossilized beings, and a hum that resonated through our very bones. It felt as though the city itself was aware of us, guiding us deeper, unraveling its secrets, and changing us in ways we couldn't explain. But the deeper we went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a city. It was a tomb, and we had just woken something up. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We've seen enough." Eliza didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were locked on the crystalline casing, her expression unreadable. "We can't leave," she said finally. "Enough of this," Price barked, stepping forward. His hand shot out, gripping Eliza's arm. "We are leaving. Now." Eliza didn't resist. She allowed him to pull her back, but her gaze remained fixed on the crystal, the faint glow emanating from its surface reflected in her wide, unblinking eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This is the key to everything. We can." Price cut her off sharply. "And we will." This isn't a discussion. No one argued with him. The hum that had filled the chamber was still resonating in my chest, making it hard to think clearly. My mind felt fractured, as though pieces of it had been pulled in different directions and left shattered. Price guided Eliza out of the chamber, practically dragging her away. She twisted her neck to look back at the structure, her face caught between awe and frustration. Victor, Tessa, Malcolm, and I trailed behind. It didn't take long for me to notice that Victor had begun limping. His hand was pressed against his knee. Every few steps, I heard a faint, disconcerting crack. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded, though his face was tired and drawn. "My joints are just starting to feel loose, like they're not centered right." "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he admitted. "It doesn't hurt though. I'm good for right now." I nodded as I flexed my fingers absently, the gloves on my hands feeling tighter than they should. Without thinking, I pulled one off as we walked. The cool air bit into my skin, but the sensation was fleeting. The cold air wasn't the reason I had stopped in my tracks. It was my hand. The skin was uneven, rippling faintly as if something just beneath the surface was shifting. My pores were larger than they should have been, their edges rounded like tiny, yawning spirals. I turned my hand under my flashlight's beam. The skin moved unnaturally, almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" Victor asked, stopping beside me. "Nothing." I lied, quickly pulling the glove back on. "Just needed a moment." "Guys," Tessa interrupted. "Something's not right. We've passed this corridor before." She was right. The path ahead was disturbingly familiar. The same ribbed walls and branching arches we'd already walked through. The patterns and the fossilized surfaces were identical, down to the smallest detail. Price halted abruptly. "What the hell are you talking about?" "We're going in circles," Tessa said, her voice firm. She held up the tablet, its screen displaying a jumble of readings. "These match exactly with what I logged 20 minutes ago." "That's impossible," Malcolm groaned. "We've been following the same path." "There's no way." "Enough," Price barked, his frustration cutting through the rising tension. He slammed the butt of his flashlight against a wall, the sharp sound echoing down the passageway. "We'll double back. Find another route. keep moving. But every turn led us deeper into the labyrinth. The corridors twisted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, their layout warping into something that defied reason. A left turn looped back into the same hallway. A straight path led us to a staircase that hadn't existed moments before. "This isn't real," Malcolm muttered, his voice cracking. "It's a trick, a hallucination." "It's the city," Eliza said softly. There was a strange reverence in her voice. "It's shifting for us." Price's grip tightened on his flashlight. "Stop," he said through gritted teeth. "Just keep moving." The path ahead was indistinguishable from the one behind, but we pushed forward anyway, desperation driving us. That seemingly familiar path decided to take us somewhere different than usual. It took us to a doorway. It was massive, framed by fossilized ridges that spiraled inward like the iris of a towering, petrified eye. The edges shimmered faintly under our flashlights. "This wasn't here before," Victor said. "No," Eliza agreed. "It wasn't." "Do we go in?" Tessa asked. "We don't have a choice," Price said. The chamber stretched into the darkness, its dimensions impossible to measure in the dim light. High above, the ceiling arched like the vault of an ancient cathedral, supported by immense rib-like structures that curved inward. At the center of the chamber was the fossil. Its body was massive, easily twice the size of a normal man's, and its form was frozen in a grotesque contortion. The rib cage flared outward, angular and expansive, while the head was crowned with protrusions that appeared almost decorative. Yet there was nothing ornamental about it. The fossilized remains exuded purpose, every jagged line and sharp edge a testament to a design we couldn't even begin to understand. What made it worse was that the remains were encased in more of that translucent, faintly glowing, crystalline substance. We approached cautiously, our movements slow and deliberate. "What the hell?" Victor murmured, his voice trailing off. Eliza broke away from Price's side, her movements deliberate but unsteady. She moved closer to the fossil, her flashlight beam dancing over its surface. "It's the same as the others," she whispered. "But more." "More what?" I asked. "More advanced," she said, crouching beside the crystalline casing. "More deliberate. Look at the structure of the bones, the density, the patterns. This wasn't just a being. It was..." She trailed off, searching for a word that seemed just out of reach. "Perfect," Tessa said softly. Eliza leaned in closer, her breath fogging the crystalline surface. The faint glow reflected in her eyes as if it were drawing her in. "This is what they really looked like," she said softly, her voice filled with an almost childlike wonder. "This is who built the city." Price's knuckles whitened around his weapon. "It doesn't matter. We need to leave," he said, his voice clipped. Eliza turned to face him, her eyes resolute. "We can't," she said simply. "Don't you get it? This is what the city was protecting. This is what it was leading us to." "It's leading us into a trap," Price replied coldly. His weapon shifted slightly in her direction, though his finger remained off the trigger. "Whatever this is, it's not meant for us." "No," Eliza said, shaking her head. "It's showing us exactly what we were meant to see. This is the key to everything, the origin, the purpose. This isn't just a fossil. It's a time capsule." "For what?" Victor asked, his voice mumbled. "For survival," Eliza said. Eliza's words hung in the air, filling the chamber. "For survival," she repeated, her voice filled with silent awe. Her hand hovered inches from the crystalline casing, as if she expected it to respond, to acknowledge her. The rest of us stood motionless. frozen by a combination of fear, unease, and something else, a pull. The fossil felt alive, not in a biological sense, but in something even greater, its gravity. That much was undeniable. Price stepped forward, his boots crunching against the ground. His jaw tightened as he took in the scene before him. "That's nice, but we're done here," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "We're not touching that thing. We're not learning its secrets. And we're sure as hell not sticking around to find out what happens next." So, Eliza stepped back. Eliza didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the fossil, the faint glow illuminating her face in a way that made her features seem sharper, more angular. "You don't understand," she said softly. "We're connected to it. Can't you feel it?" "Eliza," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Price is right. We need to go. Whatever this is, whatever it wants, it's not safe." "Safe," she repeated, her lips curving into a faint, unsettling smile. "This isn't about our safety. It's about our purpose. This is what we've been looking for, what we've been missing. It's us." Her words chilled me more than the fossil itself. There was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation. She wasn't speaking to convince us. She was stating a fact. "Eliza," Price said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Back away. Now." But she didn't move. Instead, she raised her hand again, her fingertips brushing against the crystalline casing. The hum returned. It started faintly, barely audible, but it grew quickly, reverberating through the chamber like a low, resonant tide. The crystalline casing began to glow more brightly, the light spreading outward through the branching filaments that extended from its base. My hands felt clammy again, the skin under my gloves prickling with a sensation that was both familiar and foreign. "What the hell is it doing?" Victor asked. The fossil itself began to shift within the clear rock, slow, subtle movements that shouldn't have been possible. "Jesus Christ," Victor whispered, stumbling back. The rib cage of the fossil expanded slightly, as if inhaling, and the thorn protrusions on its skull pulsed faintly. The crystalline casing surrounding it cracked, hairline fractures spidering outward with a sound like splintering ice. "Move!" I shouted, but no one did. We couldn't. The broken crevices widened, and the fossilized figure inside began to writhe. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to free itself from the eons of petrification that had held it in place. Price raised his weapon, his hands shaking. "I'll shoot." "Don't," Eliza said, stepping between him and the fossil. "You'll make it worse." "How could it get worse?" Malcolm snapped, his voice cracking. "We're all ready." The casing shattered. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap, and shards of crystalline material exploded outward. We ducked, shielding ourselves as the fragments clattered to the floor. When I looked up, the fossil was standing. It was no longer made from stone. The being before us was flesh and blood. Its elongated limbs moved with a grotesque fluidity, the joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. The rib cage flared outward, the riveted, fluted edges stretching and retracting like the gills of some alien deep-sea creature. The hum in the room rose in pitch, becoming almost unbearably high, and I realized with a sickening lurch that the sound was coming from the figure itself. The awful, whistling hum was breathing. Eliza stepped forward. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Stay back." Price roared, but she ignored him. The figure moved towards her, its movements flitting. It raised one of its elongated hands towards Eliza, its angular and pointed fingers extending outward like twisted branches. It's so much, she whispered, her voice layered with something deeper, something not her own. They're showing me. Showing you what? I demanded. Everything, she said, her lips twitching into a smile. What they were, what we are. Ward reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing the pocketed surface of the figure's outstretched appendage. The moment she made contact, her body convulsed violently, her back arching as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her hand twitched and I saw it. Her skin was rippling, the pores on her arms widening into strange, spiral-like patterns that glistened faintly under the chamber's light. It wasn't just her hand. The transformation was spreading up her arm, the flesh beneath shifting and reshaping itself in ways that defiled everything we knew about our biology. Within seconds, she collapsed to the floor, motionless. The fossil shifted its attention, again, this time with more purpose. Its head turned toward us, the protrusions on its crown shifting like antennae. The whistle of its breathing became a low, guttural sound, almost like a voice, but without words. It wasn't speaking. It was singing a deep, foreign melody that wormed its way into my thoughts, reshaping them in ways that belied my understanding. I felt a sharp pain in my hand and looked down. My skin was moving again, the pores widening, the surface rippling like liquid. I flexed my fingers, and the movement sent a wave of nausea through me. I could hear the motion of my own body in ways I couldn't comprehend. What's happening to us? Victor muttered, staring at his own arm. His elbow twisted and bent in the wrong direction with an audible pop, but he didn't seem to feel any pain. It's changing us, Tessa said, her voice shaking. It's restoring us. To what? I demanded, though deep down, I already knew the answer. I looked up just in time to witness Eliza's eyes flutter open, and for a moment, they looked normal. But that moment quickly faded when they shifted over. Her pupils had dilated and contracted, without due cause. It was as if they were trying to focus on something just beyond the edge of our existence. Beyond us. It was at that point she turned her head toward me. I watched as her pupils split open and revealed a second iris beginning to peek through. We need to leave, Price said, his voice hard. How? Malcolm asked, his voice breaking. His arms were now visibly distorted, the flesh bulging unnaturally beneath his sleeves. Price raised his weapon, pointing it at the figure. No! Eliza shouted. She stood up and stumbled between Price and the living fossil, her movements unnatural, her body twisting as the transformation had reached deep inside her core. You don't understand. It's not an enemy. It's us. Price didn't hesitate. He fired. The gunshot echoed through the chamber, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the fossil's ribcage, splintering the porous surface but doing little else. The figure turned toward Price as if his act of aggression had compelled something within it. The being raised its hand towards us, its elongated fingers twitching in a rhythmic, almost dance-like pattern. The hum in the chamber deepened. Shapes began to form in the air around us, intricate geometric patterns that flickered like static. I clutched my head as a sharp pain lanced through my skull. Images flooded my mind. Landscapes of impossible configurations, endless cities stretching into infinity, and figures, dozens of them, moving in synchronized, choreographed gestures. I stumbled, falling to my knees. The visions were relentless, each one more vivid and incomprehensible than the last. I could feel my body changing, the pores spreading all throughout my form, expanding further, my skin shifting like it no longer belonged to me, bubbling, growing. The being stepped closer, and I saw its torso expand slightly, as if drawing in air. Its chest opened, not with a mechanical movement, but like a flower unfurling. Inside was something worse than flesh, a latticework of veins, tendons, and translucent organs, pulsing with a sickly, yellow light. Its movements began making sense to me, forming words through its very gesticulations directly into my mind. I couldn't look away. I was transfixed on it. The light in its chest grew into my eyes until it consumed my vision. For a moment, there was nothing around me, just an endless expanse of white, stretching in all directions. And then the visions returned, stronger, clearer. I saw the city as it once was, alive and pulsating, its structures flowing and shifting as a united coalition of living organisms. I saw the beings who had built it, their bodies fluid and ever-changing, their movements synchronized in a dance that defied language itself. And then I saw their end, a living darkness, vast and consuming, spreading throughout the city like a plague. The beings fought it, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that exuded their own fear. But it was futile. Their city was dying, and they had no choice but to preserve what they could. They cultivated their DNA and spread it across the world before encasing themselves in stone and crystal, waiting for a time when the darkness would pass. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, we were their hope. We were their repository. When the visions faded, I was on my knees, gasping for breath. The chamber was silent again, the hum gone, as was the being, though Eliza was now standing where it had been, her back to us. "Eliza," I called out, my voice barely my own. She turned, her movements fluid and surreal, as if her bones acted independently from her own muscle. Her face, if it could still be called that, was a culmination of her former self and something utterly foreign. The patterns on her skin spiraled outward, riveted and fractal, like countless open, pulsating sores. Her eyes, now innumerable, were scattered throughout the entirety of her face, each one focused on me. "Eliza," I said, my voice broken, her lips twisted into a final smile that didn't reach her misshapen features. "It's fantastic, isn't it? This is what we were meant for. This is what we are," she rasped, her voice layered with infinitely frayed vocal strums. "We're not anything like that," Victor shouted, his voice cracking. He was hunched over, one arm cradled against his chest. His elbow had fully bent backward, the joint bulging terribly beneath his skin. Eliza's smile expanded across her jawline, her teeth now sharp and uneven, shifting and reforming, as though they were being remade from the inside out. "You will be." The chamber convulsed violently as a new resonating noise erupted from the walls. I fell to my knees as the floor beneath us buckled. Cracks raced through the fossilized surface, and a foul, organic stench wafted up from the fissures, thick and choking. I gagged, the air clinging to my throat like oil. Pulsating biological material shimmered under each of the cracks as the city itself began breathing. "We need to leave. Now!" Price yelled, dragging Tessa to her feet. Victor screamed, and I turned to see his body contorting abhorrently. His spine arched, the vertebrae jutting out sharply against his shirt as if they were trying to escape his skin. His fingers elongated, the nails splitting and curling backward as new, jagged growths pushed through. "Oh God!" he gasped, his voice wet and choking. He clawed at his throat, and I saw his neck ripple, the muscles shifting and bulging as though something inside was trying to tear its way out. "Victor!" Tessa cried, reaching for him. "Leave him!" Price snapped, yanking her back. Victor's body convulsed one final time before collapsing into a twitching heap. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. The honeycomb patterns we'd seen on Eliza were spreading across his skin, the flesh rippling and bubbling. "We can't leave him," Tessa shouted, tears streaming down her face. "He's already gone," Price said, his voice harsh. The chamber groaned again, the walls shuddering violently as pieces of the fossilized structure began to break away. Large fragments crashed to the ground, sending up plumes of dust and debris. The city's breath had become a roar. "We're leaving," Price shouted, grabbing me and Tessa by the arm. Malcolm stumbled behind him as we fled toward the nearest corridor, the sounds of the collapsing chamber echoing behind us. The corridor twisted and shifted as we ran, the layout of the city warping around us. The walls began to pulse, the permeable surface rippling with living tissue. Faint alien patterns flickered in the edges of my vision, twisting, contorted designs that moved in abnormal, aberrant motions. "Adrian Price!" Tessa screamed. I turned to see Malcolm collapse to the ground, his body writhing as his arms and legs twisted at sharp angles. His jaw unhinged, the bones cracking audibly as his teeth stretched into uneven points. His eyes rolled back into his head and a guttural, choking sound escaped his throat. Price growled and wordlessly dragged Tessa forward. We bursted into another chamber, this one smaller. "There!" Price pointed to an opening at the far end of the room. We stumbled through. My legs burned with every step, my lungs straining for air that tasted like copper and reeked of iron. Behind me, Tessa was heaving. Her body had started to falter. Her legs were giving out beneath her. I turned back instinctively, grabbing her under the arms to haul her up. My hands tingled when they touched her, the skin on my palms stretching like wet paper. The pores had widened further into chaotic patterns that pulsed faintly, like endless tiny mouths gasping for air. "Don't stop," I said, my voice trembling as I pulled her forward. "We're almost there." She didn't respond. Her wide eyes were fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. I looked down and saw that her fingertips had split open, each one tipped with delicate, translucent filaments that fluttered in the stale air like the fronds of an anemone. I forced myself to look away. It wasn't long after that we saw our salvation. The floodlights near the elevator shaft illuminated our path, a faint promise of survival etched into the dim light of the corridor's end. We followed that guiding light directly into the elevator room. The cage sat in the center, its grated doors hanging open like a toothless maw. "Get in," Price shouted, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room as he ran forward. The three of us stumbled into the elevator, Price slamming the gate shut behind us. He grabbed the lever and yanked it down hard. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt my stomach twist. Then, with a lurch that nearly knocked us off our feet, the cage began to ascend. The roar of the city below us deepened, resonating through the metal frame of our frail haven. I clung to the railing, my new hands leaving faint smudges of something viscous on the metal. "We're going too slow," Tessa whispered. Price didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the lever. The elevator groaned under the strain, the cables above us creaking ominously. A deafening cacophony of noise erupted from below, and I turned to see the shaft collapsing under us, the walls folding inward like the crushing fist of some ancient, unseen colossus. The city was consuming itself for a purpose unknown, altering what it had been, and closing the chapter we had so foolishly reopened. A wave of dust and debris climbed up the shaft with terrifying speed as the crevice under us fluctuated. "Hold on!" Price shouted. The elevator jolted violently as the cable strained, the motor above us whining in protest. Dust and fragments of rock rained down, and I shielded my head. The elevator surged upward, faster now, as though the city itself were hurling us away, rejecting us like a foreign body. Then, with a final, shuddering jolt, we broke free. The elevator ground to a halt at the surface with a shriek of tortured metal, jolting violently before the cage doors groaned open. We stumbled out. Above us, the night sky stretched vast and indifferent, the stars glittering like distant, unfeeling eyes. The military outpost stood a short distance away, its harsh floodlights cutting through the darkness like spears of piercing light. I remember collapsing onto the dew-covered ground. My hands sank into the dirt, and for a moment, I was struck by the cold dampness that seared into my palms. The pores seemed to drink in the dampness. It wasn't like touching soil anymore. It was like my body was trying to fuse with it. "Get up," Price rasped. He reached for Tessa, pulling her to her feet. Her filament fingers twitched uncontrollably, each movement sharp and spastic. I forced myself upright, my legs trembling with every step as we began the agonizing trek toward the outpost. In the harsh glare of the floodlights ahead, I saw shadows moving, figures emerging from the main building. They moved with precision, their weapons raised and aimed squarely at us. "Don't come any closer," one of them shouted, his voice edged. The beam of a flashlight cut across us, and I saw the horror reflected in their eyes. They weren't just afraid of us. They were recoiling. Price began, but he stopped mid-sentence, clutching his stomach with a low groan. He fell to his knees, his head bowing as his shoulders convulsed. His fingers clawed at his chest. "Price!" I shouted, rushing to his side, but he raised a trembling hand to stop me. "Stay back," he choked out, his voice thick with pain. I hesitated, helpless, as his body began to convulse. The permeable patterns on his skin darkened, spreading rapidly across his chest and limbs like a malignant tide. His ribs shifted beneath his skin, pressing outward in malformed, misshapen shapes. His spine arched sharply, and I heard the sickening crack of bone as his arms elongated. His eyes, once clear and defiant, blackened into dozens of pupil-like specks, the increasing number of dark voids swallowing the light around them. Tessa let out a strangled cry behind me that tore my attention from Price. I turned just in time to see her clutching her face. The filaments at her fingertips were growing longer, thrashing and curling like tiny, sentient vines. Her hands clawed at the air as if trying to tear the transformation away, but the act was futile. She collapsed, writhing on the ground, her body convulsing as the transformation overtook her completely. Her legs twisted, the bones audibly snapping and reforming, her torso elongating as honeycomb-like patterns etched themselves across her exposed skin. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't screaming. She was changing, and so was I. I wanted to scream. My mind begged for it, clawing desperately at the edges of my sanity, but no sound came. My throat refused to obey, my body frozen in place. It wasn't fear that held me still. It was something worse. My legs refused to move, no longer mine to command. The betrayal wasn't just psychological, it was physical. My own flesh had turned against me. My hands, my arms, the sight was incomprehensible. The pores on my skin had widened, spiraling outward in faint geometric patterns. My fingers trembled, their proportions subtly wrong, elongating in ways that made my joints ache. and my own face felt foreign, tight, stretched, as though it no longer fit the contours of the bones beneath. I tried to steady my breathing, but it hitched and faltered the air, clawing its way down my throat as if it had lost a pathway to my lungs. Around me, chaos had erupted. The soldiers barked orders, their voices sharp and panicked, slicing through the night air. I felt hands on me, rough, calloused, and firm. They grabbed at my arms and shoulders, dragging me forward with force. I didn't resist. I couldn't. Move. Get him inside, one of the soldiers yelled. He sounded afraid. I stumbled, barely registering the uneven ground beneath my feet as my vision swam. Behind me, the roar of collapsing earth grew louder. I turned my head just enough to see past my armed escorts. The earth had begun convulsing like a living thing, the ground buckling and folding inward in waves. Chunks of rock and steel disappeared into a rapidly growing maw, being swallowed whole. I write this from an undisclosed government facility, far removed from the Appalachian wilderness where it all began. The Homo eternum, as I've come to call them, aren't just a myth. They are real. Our forebears, the architects of a world not fully our own. Though they weren't merely our ancestors, they were something greater, something beyond us in every way that matters. And now, through us, I believe they are returning. The changes in my body are undeniable proof, as are the changes in Tessa and Price, and every soldier and soul who touched us. The spiraling patterns on my skin are no longer inert blemishes. They move, pulse, and shift, alive in ways flesh and bone should never be. My senses have sharpened. My thoughts have become clearer, but they are no longer wholly my own. Their whispers, faint and insistent, thread through the fabric of my consciousness. The fragments of their being, scattered echoes seeded into us across the millennia, are awakening. The Homo eternum are reclaiming their genetics, their mastery of the organic, their profound intelligence, their terrible elegance. It was never lost. It has always been sleeping, buried beneath the layers of who we thought we were, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And yet, that is not what we should fear. The beings who built that city, who wielded dominion over flesh, time, and space, who could twist the very fabric of existence to their will. These beings, as vast and incomprehensible as they were afraid. The city wasn't simply a monument or a relic. It was a tomb, a refuge, a desperate shelter. They were not undone by arrogance or by the natural decay of their civilization. They were running. Something found them, something greater than even their unimaginable power. In the visions the city forced into my mind, I saw flickering glimpses of it, an entity so vast, so alien, that even the Homo eternum's brilliance was no match for it. Their cities fell, their brilliance shattered like glass. The Homo eternum scattered, casting fragments of themselves, of their knowledge, of their hope, outward like seeds, hoping that some part of them might endure. That hope is in us. But this transformation isn't a gift. It's a summons. They are taking back what was always theirs, and in doing so, they are preparing for what, I don't know, perhaps to rebuild, perhaps to confront the thing that shattered them. I should feel awe at being chosen as a vessel, as a part of their resurrection, and yet all I feel is dread. Their fear lingers in the corners of my restored mind like an unhealed wound. It festers, raw and omnipresent, whispering truths I don't want to hear. Whatever chased them through the endless corridors of time, whatever consumed their great civilization, is still out there, waiting, watching. The Homo eternum won't save us. They couldn't save themselves. The city isn't just a discovery, it's a warning. 1 billion years of silence has ended, and the question remains, what happens next? Love exploring terrifying mysteries? Don't miss what's coming next. Like, comment, and share to spread the fear. Subscribe to RV Horror Stories and join us for the next chapter if you dare.